Hi again from Peace Matters, a podcast on contemporary geopolitics and international relations. My name is Marila Huscha. I'm researcher and project manager at the International Institute for Peace. In this episode, we take a closer look at Donald Trump's foreign policy, examining its underlying motivations and exploring how it plays out across key global flashpoints, including Iran, Gaza, and Ukraine. We also assess the possibility of a US withdrawal from NATO, Trump's views on China, and the significance of the ongoing mass protests against his administration. To unpack these issues and more, I spoke to Edward Knudsen, doctoral researcher in international relations at the University of Oxford. Hi, Ted.
Hey.
Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to have you to discuss the US foreign policy.
Good to be back.
Yeah, you're an American living in Europe, so you have this ungrateful job now.
Yeah.
Probably every single day or every single week. And we will speak about it more broadly, but also maybe touch on some specific contexts. And I'd like to start with a very specific context that's on everyone's minds these days, it's Iran. So far, President Donald Trump hasn't achieved any goals that he stated for his war in Iran, right? He wanted the regime change there. He wanted to curb the country's nuclear program. It didn't happen. The talks in Pakistan have failed so far. He just said that there might be some sort of restart of them. But what's his goal, or what's his vision for Iran right now? He blocked the Strait of Hormuz, although before that he opposed it himself. So where is it all going?
I think his own personal goal has to be seen in kind of like personal and political terms. As he wants a sort of spectacle and a show of dominance in the way that he did get, at least on his terms, from the operation in Venezuela. And I think he also liked the previous bombing of the Fordo plant at the end of what's now called the 12-day war. This sort of one-off, dramatic, seemingly kind of shows of dominance, shows of force, without getting too bogged down. And by all accounts, he really thought that this would be another one of those. There was some great New York Times reporting on this about how the decision was made, and then the article closes out with Tucker Carlson, the media figure who's kind of more skeptical of intervention, saying but President Trump, this could be a disaster. Trump answers, "It'll be fine." Well, why do you think that? Because everything always is, right? It's that's where he was operating as I've got the magic touch, everything that I intervene in, everything I do in foreign policy is going to work out well. And then when there wasn't this rapid collapse of the regime, or just kind of everything materialized in a really positive way from the U.S.-Israeli perspective, which was also, it should be said, promised by Netanyahu in the reporting, when that didn't happen, he then sort of retrofits on all these other things of, we're going to end the nuclear program, we're going to end the missile program, we're going to open the Strait of Hormuz that was open before. So it's not there's a goal, we pursue it. It's a bunch of violence happens, retroactively decide what the goal was. And as you point out, none of those actually have even remotely been successful as of today. When we should say Wednesday the 15th, right? So put a timestamp on where we are. Yeah.
Yeah. So this sounds to me like you're also saying that there is basically no plan. Yeah. And I understand, but at the same time, it's very easy just to dismiss everything that he's doing as there is no planning. It's just all for a show. But at the same time, I feel like he does have some sort of for lack of a better word, a vision, or some sort of a strategy of what he wants to achieve. If I look at his national security strategy from last year, it was released in November, there are some things that I can think that he's really trying to do right now. Yeah, it says that the U.S. needs to establish its preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. He wants Canada to be the 51st American state. He, made his claims to Greenland. He attacked Venezuela. So all of these things are coming into some sort of, plan to me. What is it then in the end?
I agree, and I think I would have strongly agreed about a month and a half ago that there is this sort of coherent, if you squint, Western Hemisphere plan, which it should be said would be kind of a return to pre World War II U.S. foreign policy, especially in the 19th century. So you could kind of see that. But then what really throws a wrench in the gears of that type of analysis is this Iran operation, which is kind of precisely what he said he wouldn't do, is these types of kind of open-ended operations. And so in that way, I think we can kind of speak more of like Trump doesn't necessarily have a vision or a strategy, but he has instincts, right? And those instincts, I think, can be grouped together by the people that work around him in order to seemingly have a kind of Trumpist foreign policy. But Trump is always the first person to undermine any attempts at creating a coherent Trumpism, whether that's on the domestic front or the international stage. I think there's a kind of right-wing intelligentsia, such that it is like people want to kind of create this sort of Trumpism after Trump and these sorts of things. And so I think they take what's a series of sort of impulsive, instinctual decisions and then try to create a framework retroactively. Again, it's almost like they're doing with the strategies in Iran of like you don't say here's the vision, here's the action. You say, well, there's these kind of disconnected actions. Let's try to put a vision afterwards. So I think that has to be said, yeah, with the Iran intervention. I mean, now it seems like maybe they're going to go after Cuba again that they've talked about. So I think there still will be this kind of Western Hemisphere focus, or maybe more broadly, we could say like U.S. spheres of influence. And the Western Hemisphere is supposed to be one of those spheres of influence. And the second will be the Middle East, which would, of course, neglect a bit more of this like pan-Eurasian U.S. foreign policy of really trying to have anchored military bases on both sides of the Eurasian landmass through NATO on one hand, and then the close ties with South Korea and Japan on the other. Trump seems a lot less interested in that approach, which has been the really dominant U.S. worldview since 1945. It seems like, he's a little bit less interested in that, undermining NATO on one hand, and then, you've seen these reports of them withdrawing missiles and other defensive equipment from U.S. allies in Asia. And so if we were going to say there's a strategy, I do think it would be a spheres of influence one, and those top two spheres of influence would be Latin America and the Middle East.
Right. But let's maybe talk a bit about Europe, right? There was also like the rift between the European NATO members and the USA has been like so obvious on so many levels, right? The Greenland discussion, his recent threats to withdraw troops from Europe, or even to withdraw from NATO. How realistic is that he leaves Europe or the US leave Europe?
I think whether or not certain troops or certain bases leave and so on, like I think the U.S. has sort of mentally left Europe in a way, and to that extent, like if there is, say, a Russian incursion into a NATO state, which for the record I don't think is likely in any time in the foreseeable future, but does it really matter if there's U.S. troops in Germany if they're not instructed to go confront those Russian troops, right? And so the legality, the sort of legal wranglings around NATO, I think are a little bit more irrelevant, right? NATO is a treaty, and it's very famously hard for the U.S. to enter into treaties, but that also means it's hard for them to leave treaties. So I don't think there's going to be any change to U.S. technical membership in NATO. The question is, does NATO mean anything, and can countries count on that? And I think that's a much more open question. And I have a hard time seeing Trump deploying tens of thousands of troops to the Baltics, for example. Like maybe, you don't know, but if I were them, I wouldn't be counting on that, I guess.
Right. Yeah. There are attempts in Europe, of course, to create some alternatives or to NATO defense system.
Happened for a while, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you assess those, and maybe more generally, how do you assess Europe's response to Trump's foreign policy in general, or maybe his approach to Europe in particular? What do they do well? Maybe you can say a couple examples, and then where can they improve or change their approach?
Yeah, this has been a story. these sentences, right, of like Europe's maybe reacting, trying to develop more autonomous defense capabilities. Like, could probably have said that sentence about any time in the last 20 years or so, and it would still be true. And I'd give a similar answer of, well, there's some positive signs, but it looks like it's not fully conceived. And that is indeed the case today. And we've thought many times, okay, maybe this is the final straw. Maybe this is what finally will kick them into gear. And again, we haven't seen that repeatedly. Some of this does have to do, I would like highlight two major issues. One is a sort of culture of Atlanticism in the U.S., right? There's culture of Atlanticism in the former U.S. elite and definitely in the current European elite, where, there are all these sort of elite interchange programs, right? Atlantic-Brücke is like maybe the most famous one with Germany, but they have them in every country, right? There's been a really, like, through NATO, it's not just a military alliance. There's really been since the 1950s a very strong kind of cultural elite network creation program. And so the people at the heights of European politics have often been through those programs. And even if they haven't, they've been sort of steeped in that culture. And so I think especially like kind of older generations, Gen X and above, they really find it unfathomable that the U.S. isn't this ally, and not even allies in a kind of equal way, but this sort of almost like big brother kind of thing. Or I mean, most embarrassingly, like Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, calling Trump daddy, right? There's this sort of, I don't know, patriarchal or like kind of awe that some, like I said, middle-aged and above European elites have about the U.S. And I think that makes it really hard for them to fully say, like, this country is not on our side anymore. We really need to take some steps in a different direction. And the other one would be divisions within European NATO states, right, where the more northern and eastern countries are a lot more loath to fully kind of step away from NATO for understandable reasons, right? If you're worried about what they see as a potentially imminent invasion, even if there's a 50% chance the U.S. military is on your side, well, that's worth kind of kissing the ring of Trump for that chance, right? Whereas the farther west you go, I think you can see that with say, for example, Spain, right? One, there's less threat perception. Two, I think the culture's a little different, and so they're a lot more willing to take steps in a different direction. And whether these things can cohere is still an open question. I mean, Europe spends enough money on defense, right? There's this big push now, we need to spend more. But if you take, even a relatively small number of a really big number, so, a small percentage of a large European GDP, that still creates a big defense budget. The real question, and has been for a long time, is coordination, right? How do we sort of, rather than having a lot of small kind of national champions that all try to produce everything, and so, every country tries to have a kind of full spectrum capability, but fails because they're too small, rather than saying, okay, Poland will be the tank country, France will be the fighter jet country, like sort of a division of labor. But countries don't want to do that because defense is a very, closely held thing, right? If, you say, okay, well, we have no ability to make our own tanks, right? That can be a scary prospect. But the situation now is there's a reliance on U.S. weapons. And so for Europe to have greater sovereignty as a whole, countries will have to sacrifice their sovereignty in one way or another. They basically need to decide, do we want to stop having our sovereignty auctioned off to the U.S. and start giving it to other European countries who I do think have more aligned interests.
Do you see that happening?
I think it'll take a couple more shocks. I do hope it'll happen at some point. I mean, and the thing is that if they're really, and maybe it won't happen before a real kind of crisis faces Europe, and they'll take kind of baby steps in that direction. Countries, when they're under grave threats, do things really, really quickly. All the rules kind of go out the window. And so I think if a huge crisis happens, things will get kicked into gear. And it'll take some of that pre-preparation that's happening now. But no, in 5 years, I don't think Europe's going to have a sort of collective military that's going to be able to emulate the capacities of one of the great military powers. But hopefully can set some of the groundwork conditions for getting there if it needs to.
In this context, maybe if we look at Ukraine, there was also a very different response from Europe to, or lack of support to Trump's, initiatives to talk to Russia, to negotiate, and so on. But also lately, Trump seems to have given up on Ukraine, or what is happening there? Is he still involved? Is something still going on?
Potentially in the background, but I think this Iran thing has kind of sucked all the oxygen out of that, such to the extent there was really any. I mean, you had kind of famously like Witkoff and Kushner, right? These sort of real estate guys who have been put in the position of negotiating these like great agreements with different world powers. And apparently, like the way they scheduled some of these negotiations was they had a couple hours booked in for Russia-Ukraine negotiations. And okay, gotta go. Let's do the Iran negotiations now, which is a crazy way to do this. Like this is, these are both huge topics that deserve dedicated experts and days of negotiation in their own right. Not, some sort of corporate type job. They're like, oh, I've got a 3:30 with HR, and then I've got to go talk to finance at 5. Like it's just that's not how you solve these problems, as we've seen, because they're not solved.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there is actually at all any role left for professional diplomats in the U.S. foreign policy, right? Because it always seems that it's the same circle of close people to Trump who are doing all the negotiations. And what do diplomats do? What does the State Department do? I mean, are they still involved in these high-level political discussions, or are they reduced to, bureaucrats, just doing the paperwork?
So something about the U.S. civil service in general and State Department, included in that, is there's always a much larger group of political appointees than in a lot of European countries, right? Normally you have maybe obviously the top minister is a political appointee in Europe, and then maybe the people one rung below that, and maybe the one rung below that. But in the U.S., it goes like 4 or 5 deep, and so you have just way more sort of politicization of the different key departments in the federal government. And so, and then that's not a Trump thing, right? That does leave the civil service more prone to politicization when there's someone who wants to do that. But Democrats have that. You have big donors who get the ambassadorship to a nice country like Japan or the UK, right? This has been happening for a long time, and so in that sense, like expertise has always been a little bit sidelined in a way because the actual regional experts are just not going to be at that higher political level. And also because the U.S. defense apparatus is so big, the relative influence of the State Department is often a lot less, right? There'll be issues, for example, in Iraq. I think the State Department was saying, well, no, full-on de-Baathification is a really bad idea. Like, yeah, someone was in the Ba'ath Party, but they know how to run the sewers, right? Don't kick them out of the of the post-war settlement, right? Because we need some people who know how to run the country. The military says no, get rid of them all. And so you have these things where the State Department will have kind of better ideas, and then they're disregarded. And so those are two dynamics that go back a lot farther. Enter Trump, especially Trump 2, where they actually have kind of developed some cadres and, I won't say experts, but some more sort of foot soldiers in their 4 years out of power. That plus a real just sort of disdain of expertise in general. And then maybe third add, the Doge thing. That really creates a kind of perfect storm where you already have a pretty disempowered bureaucratic and diplomatic corps. You add to that just huge reductions in the number of people there, and then you take people that just don't want to hear from experts in general. So that all combined really, really creates a dynamic that professional diplomats seemingly have very little influence in this. And yeah, having, J.D. Vance plus 2 real estate guys trying to negotiate these issues they don't seem to really understand. I mean, these are issues that people work on, right? Last night we had this panel. I was like, you have experts that have worked on this stuff for decades, right? It's something you really, really need to know about in a lot of ways. And yeah, in a democracy that will be subordinated to political interests, but that's how the system worked before. And now you just have the pure politics and really on top of that, the spectacle. And below that, very few experts who are actually being heard.
It sounds a bit to me like there is, I don't know if it's a conscious or unconscious attempt to basically to substitute at least part of the political elite more broadly. So it's not about the high-level appointees, but generally to try to do some bigger change in the whole, like elite landscape in the country. Am I right?
Yeah, I think you are, and there would be precedent for that. Sort of famously, like one of the big disappointments of sort of the right wing populist challenger from decades ago in the Nixon administration was you have this new figure in, and a lot of people on the right are really excited about that after the kind of dominance of the Democrat New Deal coalition since FDR. And Nixon's in there, great. We're gonna reform the system and all this, but there'd been no time to kind of build up those groups of people. So Nixon had to appoint a lot of liberals in these positions and wasn't able to reform the government to the extent that he wanted to. And then once Reagan comes around, there had been this effort, right? Training right-wing legal figures, right-wing diplomats, right-wing civil servants, and so on. And then Reagan was really able to reshape the government in his image in a pretty striking way. And so I think you could see Trump as a little bit analogous to that kind of Reagan revolution, not exactly in terms of form, but yeah, in terms of the idea of creating a new kind of elite.
Right. How much do they look to some European forces in this sense? Because especially I'm wondering about the example of Hungary, right? There was an election just 2 days ago where Viktor Orban, who was in power for 16 years, was outvoted by a landslide. And just a couple of days before the election, the Vice President Vance had visited him to express the support. Did they not expect that happening, that he will be outvoted, or was the United States and the administration there, were they not seeing it as a potential blow to them if they go and support him and then he's outvoted? Is it somehow interpreted? Is it somehow taken into account? Maybe it doesn't matter at all. I don't know. Hungary is a small country after all, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important that they sent Vance there and not Trump, right? They didn't let the big man be the one who takes the fall for this because they can read polls.
I think Trump said once that if it's a failure, then it's Vance's fault, but if it's a win, then it's him.
And to a certain extent, that's a kind of common workplace dynamic, right? But more so with Trump, yeah. And this is also a classic thing in U.S. politics, right? Is like you send the vice president to do the dirty work, It's like, Kamala Harris had to do this too. Oh, you're the border czar, okay, dealing with this issue that nobody wants, and so we've seen that before, and I think that's what happened with this. Because it would be kind of humiliating if Trump goes there and then, oh well, he can't really flip the dial on that. So they didn't do that. I don't think it really matters that much for U.S. interests to have an Orban government in Hungary. I think where that actually matters a lot more is in European politics, Ukraine aid, things like that. That's where the existence of that regime in Hungary had material impacts on what goes on. It doesn't really affect the U.S. that much. Where it did affect the U.S. was on the symbolic level for sure. All these cuts to the media, the kind of Doge politicization that we were just talking about, right? They explicitly looked to Orban as a model for that. Project 2025 was in some ways kind of explicitly modeled on what they saw in Hungary. And I think they saw themselves as, okay, well, this is how we become this new, what they'd hoped would be a kind of a permanent coalition, right? At least for 16 years, which you never get in American politics anymore. So I think that was very important on that level. Also, as a political model, but also has this kind of symbol in a weird way of like, this is the return to the Christian West, which, if you look at the demographics of Hungary, it's not a very religious country, but they think what they want. So I think they liked it on that level. And it was useful for Orban, of course, to tie these links to the global right and become a symbol of that. Eventually, I think the people actually who vote for you got sick of that. They want to have their country run in an efficient way. They don't need their president to be going around to right-wing conferences and being the hero of that. And so I don't think it'll matter for the U.S. I think it's more of a moral defeat than anything.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are also now some mass protests happening in the U.S. itself, and by some estimates, millions of people take part in them. I don't know how correct it is, but yeah, what could their end goal be, or how, or maybe even not that. Do they have any alternative narrative or any alternative solution? I know that that's maybe not the the purpose of protests, right? To have alternatives. They're more anti something, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, is there anything that they could significantly change in the system how it is right now? And just a small remark from me, it was a bit chilling to read these posters of some protesters saying we want a regime change in the United States.
Yeah.
It's like something coming like from usually countries under dictatorship. So it was very like striking for me to see how people perceive it there.
Yeah, I will say, like in one of my like first, big political awakening moments was during the Iraq War protests in like 2003, and I do remember a lot of people having signs that said "Regime change begins at home," which I still think is kind of funny.
Not a new thing.
So it's not really a new thing, yeah. And I mean that's how people. See it, and there's a little bit of joking to it, or the Bush administration had these like card deck with top level Iraqis. We got the ace of spades or whatever, the defense minister, whatever it was. And I remember people more like liberals in the U.S. Understanding of the word, they made a card deck of like the Bush administration. So Rumsfeld is the ace or whatever the case may be. And so yeah, there's this like people drawing parallels between what the U.S. says about foreign regimes, and then it can be kind of, I think, interesting to just use that language and just turn it around on the U.S. rather than like, oh, we have governments and administrations and they have regimes, right? Well, okay, maybe we should compare them. Maybe there's some uncomfortable similarities there.
So you can also say it's sort of a self-reflection process. It's not that bad in this.
Yeah, and there's some humor to it.
Okay.
I do think, well, if you look at really, you could say the past 15 or even 25 years, if we're going to include the Iraq War protests, it's not a great track record for protests. And, so it's hard to think of a real kind of demand that we got of this. I guess there were some changes after the George Floyd ones. A lot of those were reversed. I mean, I don't want to discount the hard work that activists and organizers do and say that nothing is achieved, but it's never been this kind of big scale thing. With the No Kings protests, they would say that the strength is that it's relatively amorphous, right? It's a broad tent where you get kind of, good Republicans all the way to kind of more left-wing groups. What is interesting is that there hasn't been any kind of separate anti-war protests, which was a huge thing. I mean, some of the biggest protests in world and U.S. history were around in 2003. What I've seen is the organizers say, oh, well, if you want to make it an anti-Iran war protest, that's fine. Bring your sign to that. But, we're not going to rebrand it as that. There's some strengths to that, you bring in a lot of people who can kind of just are broadly kind of more pro-democracy, et cetera. The risk is that it's just too nebulous and ill-defined. And it's like, well, what do you really want, And what's the outcome? Like voting in the midterms, right? There are these real structural problems in the U.S., right? Even if you get rid of this administration, there's the Supreme Court, which bakes in a lot of right-wing policies. There's gerrymandering, a lot of right-wing power at the state level, right? And so they think just focusing on the No Kings element of it maybe leaves something to be desired. At the same time, it is a pretty capacious thing, and you could very easily take that into the realm of foreign policy making, right? It's Congress that's supposed to declare war, right? And having this, it is a very king-like assumption of power to say, I can just declare war wherever I want. And so maybe if it can be sort of targeted or honed in a certain way, it could be a bit more effective. But Trump's never been a popular president, right? There's this weird idea, especially after 2024, that there's been this, they called it the vibe shift in the U.S., right? That now the whole country is right wing because not even a majority voted for Trump and won by 1.5 points. But I think that was really overread in terms of a cultural moment. And so now I think sometimes No Kings is seen as this big sea change the other way. And it is in a little way. There have been, especially young men have really shifted to the left, who were a big Trump. Their support of Trump was a big thing in the election. There have been some shifts, but the energy behind No Kings, that was sort of there. It was just latent for a little while because people were a bit cowed by the election result. But there's never really been majority support for him. I think he hit like 51% for like 2 weeks or something right after the election. It's not like he was this dominant figure, like say like an Orban or something, and then now there's opposition to it. It's more of a return to the norm of him just as a very unpopular politician.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, because I was also stumbling in the past days into these headlines. Trump's support base is like he's losing it, and his approval ratings are so low. And then I checked them, and his approval rating is 38% or about that, and disapproval is over 50. Okay, there is some difference, but 38% is not that little. I don't know, at least by my standards, as I understand it. How would you interpret that? Is he really like losing his support base this much? Or maybe is this support base that he still has is still sufficient for him to stay and do things in the way that he's been doing so far?
Yeah, I think that's also a product of the polarization, or as they call it, like negative polarization in the U.S. system, where you like your side and you hate the other side, but really mostly you hate the other side, and so they'll say, no, okay, I like Trump because the libs hate him. So that is just a real kind of durable factor in U.S. politics. At the same time, elections are always won or lost by such a narrow margin that, okay, slipping from 41 to 38, that's the election. That's the whole game. At this point, though, the way the U.S. system works is he could be at 20. And I don't think it necessarily matters for his ability to do things, right? It's not a parliamentary system. You can't trigger a no confidence vote. Even if someone is impeached and removed, the vice president becomes the president, right? You can't actually really get a change of party in these 4 years. And so, from like, it's a good sign in terms of it looks like, Trumpism is not going to be this dominant force for generations in the U.S., but you can do a lot of damage in a short space of time, right? We're not even at the halfway mark of Trump's term. And so will a lack of popularity in the last 2 years of an aging president's term, is that going to make him become more reasonable and say, well, the country's really against me, I need to moderate? Or is he going to say, tear it all down, I'm going to do what I want and act even more erratic? And so it might be good news that his polls are slipping a little bit. That might be good news for the election. I don't know that that's necessarily good news for his conduct in office for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, we now dived a little bit deeper into the domestic discussion, but let me come back to the foreign policy aspects of that. And one of the things that I find also very relevant or interesting is that his private interests or the interests of his family seems to be very much tied to some of his foreign policy decisions, right? There is a lot of stories of his family, his sons buying up property, or son-in-law buying up property, I don't know, in the Middle East, in the Western Balkans, and so on. So how much does this aspect play into his decision-making?
In one sense, with this war in Iran, you could almost wish it played into it more. Not in favor of any of this corruption. But, one of the positives, I guess, of globally integrated capitalism, in theory, is that should produce a peace coalition. I mean, famously, right, like 1910, the Norman Angell book, The Great Illusion, saying, we're never going to have a huge conflict. There's so much globalization, so many international businesses. We're making so much money. Why would we start a world war? Okay, well, that did happen. And then he wrote a similar thing again, and then it happened again. So that doesn't always work in practice, but you'd hope, or in the context of China, right? U.S. businesses saying, okay, well, let's settle it down here on this confrontation, right? We still benefit from this. It does seem like in a lot of cases, though, kind of politics trumps economics, and people will still go to war when it's not in their self-interest, right? You'd hope, if you have a lot of properties in Qatar and the UAE, okay, maybe let's not start a war, that those places will get battered. That obviously didn't happen. I think they underestimated the likelihood of Iran actually attacking those states. I think maybe with Israel and the sort of peace plan in Gaza, I think maybe you can see some more interest there, talking about building these hotels, this kind of grotesque thing of these like hotels in Gaza. And I think there's a more kind of direct financial interest there. But I do, and I think that the sort of Abraham Accords project, that fits more that self-interest thing. What's weird about the war is, in the ways we identified earlier, in terms of, politics, geostrategy, and then also I think kind of naked self-interest, right? I don't see a huge benefit for the Trump family from this, but maybe those interests will assert themselves in the long run a bit more.
Yeah, you mentioned Gaza, and what is happening there right now, or what is Trump's involvement or his administration's involvement in it so far? Yeah, he created this board of peace that's supposed to handle the transition, but somehow lately we haven't heard much about it. Is it still involved? Is it still functioning, or what is happening on the ground? Because I also remember there was, of course, a lot of unresolved things, like there was a ceasefire and some sort of agreement, but then each party questioned it from their side, so it wasn't that clear-cut deal.
Yeah, and I mean, Israel has basically taken half of what was already a very overcrowded area as a kind of buffer zone. I think that's also fallen back on the priority level a little bit. I mean, even for Israel and its sort of occupation of new lands, they're focused on Lebanon as well. Obviously, they're still in Gaza, and the people there are still suffering from complete destruction of infrastructure, not enough aid. I mean, all these things that we've heard about for a long time, but now don't because it's not getting bombed every single day. Still, degree of violence there. A lot of those problems are still ongoing there, and so that has not been resolved at all from the perspective of the Gazans. I think for the kind of bigger powers in the region, their focus is elsewhere for now. The Board of Peace thing, I mean, it's had its own kind of mission creep where, it was set up as a kind of specifically about Gaza, and now it's supposed to be this kind of globe-spanning, like, new UN Security Council. But the countries in it are a kind of a rogues gallery, right? It's not your sort of diplomatic powerhouses that you're used to, right? I mean, so I don't know that that's really going to have a huge impact, or that we should really expect a kind of grand settlement in Gaza. Like, it might just be this sort of continuation of ambiguity and kind of increasing suffering there, which I hate to say, but, kind of people even more cordoned off into smaller areas, while maybe they built some grotesque hotel. It's tough to say what's going on there, but no, the Board of Peace is not some sort of panacea that's going to create prosperity for everybody.
All right. Maybe let's also speak a little bit about China, since it's a very prominent actor these days, and by many already previous administrations, it was identified as the main challenge to the United States. But apparently, as it seems to me, Trump, at least lately, has forgotten about it. He now, remembered and mentioned it again in connection with Iran, and again threatened tariffs and so on. But do you think, in general, he's satisfied with his tariff policy and doesn't care about the rest? Or is it just, other headlines that keep our attention away of something that's going on maybe behind the scenes more intensively?
Yeah, I think China's a tricky one from Trump's perspective because it's hard to win. Like, it's easy to beat up on Venezuela, Cuba. Well, he thought it would be easy to beat up on Iran. China, they kind of tried, right? And then they were really able to leverage their dominance in the mineral sector. And I think they're kind of staying away from that a little bit because it seems a bit too thorny, and it's, take these long-term investments in chip production and, high-tech manufacturing. That's boring for Trump, right? This was a kind of Jake Sullivan sort of thing in the Biden administration. And I think it's too tedious for a lot of people there, even though there are some people in the Trump administration who do identify China as this kind of great nemesis. And they've even tried to say the aggression against Iran is like this master stroke, and also in Venezuela, that we're going to take away China's outposts and allies in order to corner them eventually. I think that's just wishful thinking. So from China's perspective, I think they can just sort of continue to sit back and watch this sort of implode in a bunch of ways. Like China, obviously, I think, has some degree of ambitions. I don't think they want to become a global hegemon like the US. I think they do want to become the dominant force in East Asia. And if you have a US that's willing to just sort of make blunder after blunder, well, let's just sit back and let them do it, right? The Napoleon quote, like, don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. I think I'm sure they've read that. That's what they're doing. And I think that's the main theme there, especially with what I was saying earlier, with the sort of spheres of influence, which I think they're kind of ceding the sphere of influence in East Asia. You might not love to hear that if you're in Japan or South Korea at this moment, Vietnam as well, some others. But yeah, I think there's not a huge focus on that. And maybe we'll see a Democratic administration try to get back to that. But, China's taking the long game. Like, they've been investing for a while, basically making their foreign policy doctrine to expand their economic influence geographically, but not get embroiled in wars like this. And so maybe it'll be such a foregone conclusion that China is a U.S. peer or is even dominant in some sectors that hopefully the next administration won't try to overturn that through some kind of violent conflict, which, apparently it almost came to blows with China at some point during the Biden administration. And hopefully this sort of fantasy that China can be subjugated or that we can go back to 1999 and, not normalize trade relations and prevent their rise, right? There's this sort of almost like lost cause myth with China that somehow we can just put them back in the box and just make them be a small unimportant country again. It's not going to happen.
Super interesting. I just have one very last and naive question, maybe, I don't know, or idealistic one. To put it shortly, is there a chance for peace? Should we maybe all sit back like China does and wait till this whole system and this whole mess implodes and then, normal times begin again? Or what are your projections? What should we, we as individuals, as, normal, I don't know, countries and states do?
Yeah, I think there's not going to be another... If there is peace, it's not going to come through, one kind of dominant force, right? Old like Pax Britannica or, Pax Americana of the 20th century, which are both kind of misnomers. But it's not going to be the sort of like hegemonic style peace. If there is something, I think it's going to be countries embracing their self-interest in a cooperative way, right? I think, for example, like Pedro Sanchez was in China, and there doesn't need to be ideological alignment, right? Like Spain wants to stay a democracy. They don't want to adopt the Chinese system, but he's very clear that, hey, China's a rising power. Like, we need to have good ties and good relations with them. I think other countries in Europe and kind of like-minded allies abroad need to adopt that type of approach without giving into these kind of more hawkish narratives that, oh, well, that's supporting authoritarianism, right? Like, no, you don't have to like the Chinese domestic model to say China is a fact of life, right? Like, we should get along with them. We can also increase prosperity for our people if we work closely with them. And so I think if there is peace, it's not going to come through this kind of like dominant sort of militarist version that we're going to, completely defeat Russia. We're going to completely defeat China. We're going to make everybody like a Western democracy, right? That's kind of the end of history vision, right? That in my mind, totally dead. And if there is a version of peace, it's not going to be a terribly ideological one. It's going to be one in which countries need to, actually, focus on their own self-interest and domestic welfare, but realizing that peace is in their self-interests. And I think that's not something that some people like to hear, because, we live in liberal democracies, we like all these freedoms and so on. It sounds kind of bad to say, oh, well, we're not going to try to change every government into a democracy and make them like us. But that's a recipe for war, right? It's better to let countries sort of liberalize, democratize on their own without external pressure, because what have we learned in many cases? When you attack countries, they get more right-wing typically. So don't do that. Instead, try to focus on productive ties where you can find them.
Yeah. So giving up on old habits and trying to stay real and open-minded.
I think so, yeah. And like without becoming sort of, amoral or not like holding any values, but to deal with the ambiguity that it's okay to have values yourself without needing to impose them on other people, I think would be the sort of, that sounds sort of kumbaya, but that would be my approach. And then focusing on where can we derive mutual benefit, right? There's like, why isn't every European leader in China sort of saying, hey, we would love some more solar panels. Here's our products. Here's our nice wines, here's our nice fashion, whatever the case may be. That seems to be the way forward, right? And then that's sort of, deriving mutual benefit rather than trying to sort of wage these like endless struggles, or this idea that, China is this like historic opponent that Europe needs to join in this great crusade against, right? Like that's the real recipe for disaster.
Thank you, Ted, for this fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks.
All right, thanks.
This was episode 41 of Peace Matters. Thanks for listening and watching. Stay tuned for future episodes.